any intellectual movement that either defends or attacks an entire history of a people or marginalizes an entire history of a people is always flawed. So whether we are talking apologetics that sees Islamic history only in terms of a great achievement without an analytical, nuanced perception of evaluating the good and bad, is deeply flawed. Similarly, with any position taken in which the entire Islamic civilization and history becomes demonized as all evil, is also flawed. But equally flawed is any attempt to ignore that history and to think that the repository of human history is culture. And any attempt to marginalize culture, to see culture as an aberration and as as some type of deviance, and to try to base the imperative of religion solely in text and nothing else, is also equally flawed. The making of any good scholar is also the making of good piety, if you will. In the same way that a good scholar learns to evaluate and balance evidence, the essence of piety is the same thing, is that you understand the complexity of your own humanity as a person and the humanity of others. And any absolute, whether you see a history of a people as absolute good or absolute bad, whether you marginalize the history of a people and see culture as irrelevant and the only relevant thing is what you find in texts, they're all very deeply flawed positions. That, I think, is the biggest challenge that confronts many Muslims, especially those who are at the forefront of intellectual thought, is that we either tend to demonize all of our history as Muslims, or we tend to celebrate all our history as Muslims, or we tend to ignore that history altogether and think that what human experience has nothing to teach, and we simply anchor ourselves in textual commandments. Those who really delve into what Islamic text says, what the Quran teaches, what the collective tradition of the Sunnah is, what Muslim intellectuals have struggled with for centuries, would realize that the power of the Islamic message is that it embraced human beings in all their humanity, not that it negated that humanity. As the famous tradition of the Prophet says, I have been sent to perfect human ethics, not to invent human ethics. It is إنما بعثت لأتمم مكارم الأخلاق, to perfect the ethics that are already innately and naturally known to human beings. And for those who read overall Reasoning with God, but particularly chapter 8, What Really Went Wrong, will find that there's a sustained argument towards reclaiming that dynamic of embracing humanity in all its richness and all its complexity, not ignoring it, not marginalizing it, and not negating it, but embracing it from within the perspective of Islamic normativities. That is a critical point. It is not true that any part of Islamic history or the history of Muslims was lived out of the text and solely the text. And this is a basic and fundamental flaw that the Puritans, the Wahhabis, are often, an error that they often repeat, is that they think that the text can streamline and stratify and simplify the complexity of life. As I've written in Reasoning with God, if Islam from the beginning would have demanded that human beings act against their nature, Islam would have never become the world religion that it had become. And this is the biggest danger that I see coming from the puritanical movement, is that it ignores the complexity of human being. I mean, even at something as simple as art and music. When it reads the text to tell any culture in the world, music is haram, and all types of art and forms of art are haram as well, it is imposing something that is alien and artificial to what human beings are, because God has ingrained in us, in our intuitive sense, a longing for art and music. In the same way that there is a longing to know, and there's a longing for the desire to be free, and there's a longing for liberty, and there's a longing for dignity. The Islam that is in the Quran, the Islam of the Prophet ﷺ, is an Islam that does not negate these innate longings, but simply disciplines them so that they do not become hedonistic and destructive. If the Islam of Puritanism, of puritanical interpretations, was the Islam that the Prophet and the companions would have started with, Islam would have died in Arabia. It would have been born and dead in Arabia, and would have never become the historical phenomena that it did become. And that is even our lived experiences as Muslims shows that even the puritanical movement, in every society in which it has dominated, it sows the seeds of rebellion against itself immediately. And the only way it is able to maintain itself is through a very high degree of political oppression. And in my reading of history has convinced me that wherever there is human freedom, Islam thrives. And wherever there is despotism and oppression, Islam falters and dies. It is at a time when no legal system saw coercion as an inherent evil. The text of the Quran clearly identifies compulsion and coercion as an evil in and of themselves. And at a time when no one thought for a moment about the notion that a king has the right to impose upon people what the king believes to be the truth, we find that God speaks to Muhammad and says, You don't control them, and God has not sent you to control them, but simply to remind them. You have been sent as a reminder, not a dominator. فما أنت إلا مذكر لست عليهم بمسيطر. It is this impulse that I speak about, the reclaiming of that most marvelous and humane impulse, which ignited the remarkably rich cultural phenomena that we know as Islamic history, and that is suffocated by apologetics and Puritanism in our day. This is why I wrote What Really Went Wrong. That's my motivation in writing it, to explore all these elements as thoroughly as I could.